Hello there. So then, this is going to be an interesting one. So far, we've gone over some of the positive expressions of the archetypes, and it was in the last one concerning the warrior that I branched off and complemented that by talking about some of its shadow aspects. And I will say that I find it very interesting how people who have been so enthusiastic for me to talk about the shadow. I think it says something quite telling about people's want to come to terms with that aspect of their own nature, or simply it could be because the material is darker and therefore it's more intriguing. I don't know. It could very well be both. I am going to make a large video feature on the shadow sometime next year in 2018. And that's going to be a very major project. So it's essential that I don't rush it. I want to get it right because I think that the shadow is, in many ways, the most important archetype to come to terms with in life. But for now, as a kind of bridgeway into that, we can start by looking at the shadow expressions of some of the major archetypes, and then that'll set us up properly for when we actually come to deal with the shadow in the major. So today I want to talk about an aspect of our psychological expression that's tied to the warrior archetype, and that is, of course, the weakling. And this might actually be one of the most important archetypes for us to acknowledge inside our own psychology, because the weakling is very much tied to our capacity to grow through engaging with systems, and it acts as a kind of filter that mitigates our potential to advance in life. As a direct consequence of that, it's also united to our feelings of self-esteem. And I think that the best way of describing the weakling archetype, or setting up a description of the weakling archetype, is to state that it occupies that range of our ability to dwell and reflect upon our experiences in life. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. We need an honest account of our worth in order to understand the qualities that we're dealing with. And to do that, we have to be conscientious about our own strengths as well as our own shortcomings. Without that, we can't possibly strategize a way forward in our life progression. We don't have any career prospects. We don't exploit our natural talents. We never see a glimpse of what we might be capable of. And to do this, we need to possess a sensitivity over our respective dynamics as individuals, so that we might maximize our capacity for potential growth and minimize our capacity for failure and disillusionment. And like I said, the exercisation of those talents is very much tied to our feelings of self-esteem and feelings of worth. The more that we exercise our gifts, the more that we grow in our self-esteem, our sense of direction in life increases, new doors of opportunity open for us where previously there were none, and it affects the people that we come into contact with in life. And this positive application of our ability directs and defines our life progression, and likewise gives our conscious sense of life a direction and a definition. But life isn't always that linear, is it? Life is a very complex and multifaceted experience for a human being. We possess a complex architecture that is prone to breakdown and disease. We're instilled with a complex psychology and emotional life that eclipses our ability to comprehend it. And it takes a long, long time for us to mature into a position where we can even live by ourselves without supervision. We have to learn not only to function animalistically, but also how to function as an intelligent individual who is part of a collective within a shared collective vision of a society and conform effectively to its requirements. Likewise, the systems that we interface with to make life functional aren't simple either, because they've been derived from the patterns of complex organisms with their complex needs. And so life is, at the one hand, it's given to this great brilliancy and richness that is matched only by its difficulty and awkwardness. And every time a new generation gets born into the world, the whole thing has to be learned all over again. And this means that throughout our life, we will inevitably encounter failure within these systems. There is not a single human being alive who hasn't failed at something. And as we know from looking at the accounts of the most successful people in the world, multimillionaires, championship athletes, pioneering scientists, when you weigh up the total sum of all these people's efforts, it renders an image beyond our immediate expectations, because all of those people have grinded and failed over and over and over again to reach that point of victory where it becomes significant. So this is an essential distillation of the life situation that the archetypes are communing with. It's our ability to interface with the systems of life that makes life functional and gives rise to our ascent. But that requires discipline and a consistency and a willingness to encounter the difficult consequences that inevitably spring up from that. And the possibility that we will encounter failure within a system is always higher than our initial ability to steal a reward. And that goes for the animal kingdom as much as it does of ours. Failure is an inevitable and necessary companion to success. And if we have the right attitude, that failure will be a positive instructor, because it will show us the areas where we need to improve. But if we allow the blows of those defeats to penetrate our spirits, and we don't listen to them as instructors, then we will conclude to a very different destination. And I think that the key to understanding the weakling archetype is in what makes human beings different. It's that we are able to simulate our experiences internally. And that links into what I said at the beginning of the video, in how the weakling arises from our capacity to introspect and repeatedly dwell upon what we have experienced in life. Alright then, so that's more than a solid foundation to begin talking about the archetype. Life is complex, we're complex creatures, failure is antecedent to success. So now let's start talking more directly as to how this archetype arises within the human system. As we've already said, the ability to be successful in our actions is umbilically united to our self-esteem. We like to remain conscientious about our talents and abilities because they bolster our self-image. Likewise, we don't like to be conscientious of our weaknesses because they damage our self-image. And this schism, this conflict, can be very problematic for us, because if we don't like facing up to the realities of our shortcomings and our mistakes, then it will produce a dissonance between our idealized self and the nagging realities of our previous mistakes. Experience with failure germinates different reactions depending on the mentality of the individual. But for simplicity's sake, we'll place them into two broad categories here called inhibitory reactions and excitatory reactions. Excitatory reactions will cause us to overcompensate for our abilities as a defense reflex to avoid feelings of inferiority, and I'll evidence an example of how this actually works later on. But let's begin now by describing the inhibitory reflex, because I think that this will seem the most intuitive and accessible to our minds when we think about human exhibitions of weakness. The weakling manifests from a morbid preoccupation with the consequences of our life experiences. Obsessive attention given to the realities of our life events will foster an identification with the imagery of those events, converting the hero potential of the individual over into an image of perpetual impotence. A byproduct of this pattern of behavior is where the dominant weakling in the psychology unconsciously projects its warrior expression into external people or things that serve to reinforce its identification with weakness. And so the externalized image becomes a figure of fantasy where we can artificially simulate our hero potential within the security of private fantasies, and where the consequences of real life events will not threaten us. These individuals who are under the grip of the dominant weakling will often display a symbiotic attachment to escapist media like video games and pornography, where the mind can export its hero potential into these digital power fantasies and thereby satisfy the persistent need to acquire organic agency in the real world. These media present a simulation of ascent, not a real occurrence. It is an artificial system that stimulates the warrior drive within us to meet it, but because the area of our action is artificial and is not achieved by organic means, there is no meaningful payoff, making it a substitute for success in the real world. So, the weakling is a shadow deviation of the warrior ability to take action and meet with the systems of life. Even within a dysfunctional psychology, the archetypal expression is still active, but it perverts through the filter of the shadow aspect and dominance. So we could say that the weakling is the warrior expression in retrograde, and this redirects our energy inwards towards our identified self-image, and we harness that warrior aggression as a weapon against the systems of our own life. In turn, we become weak, we become normalized to the pain, and we become masochistic. The masochistic identification with weakness will inevitably affect our life prospects. When we listen to the weakling within us, we always sell ourselves short. Instead of reaching for opportunities and experiences that, with a little effort are well within our access, we always settle for the easier attainments that lie beneath our natural potential. The strategic powers of the mind that are converting through the weakling dominance are always coming up with alternative stratagems as to why we wouldn't be able to do something that we feel like we want to do, or why that interesting person over there will harm us if we talk to them, or any other kind of paranoid justification as to why we shouldn't do something that another part of our mind offers to us as a potential for victory. And this is something that I can be very familiar with when I reflect upon my past. Just to add a little personal note here, I remember I reflect upon a lot of the women that I've dated in my life, and I can definitely see examples where I have deliberately gone for women who are beneath my level threshold, you could say, and I've gone for them because they're easy. I've gone for them because they're immediate, and because I didn't believe in my own self-worth that I could actually get anything better in those parts of my life when I was identifying with weakness in that pattern. So when we identify with the weakling, we're always converting our potential worth into lead, a kind of a reverse alchemy, so to speak. We're constantly selling ourselves short and dwelling on the comforts of our own inertia that becomes a security blanket that protects us from the consequences of life that we're afraid of. So we can see here how the positive warrior aggression in us is always active. But if it's being passed through a dysfunctional part of our psychology, which is in dominance, then that otherwise externalized expression converts backwards and it paralyzes us. Not only that, but when held in its true light, our own shadow warrior is slowly killing us. It's very important when thinking about the archetypes to go beyond conceptual interests and reach into our own personal experiences, because it's there where we feel them the most prominently. So let's think of some hypothetical scenarios where the weakling might be found. And I'm going to start off with one that you might not expect if you take its common expression on face value. But if we look a bit deeper than the surface level, we can see the hidden weakling at work. So I think that we can all relate to a time where we've been in a situation with somebody who has displayed an enormous amount of personal hubris. Maybe it was us, or maybe it was somebody that we've been in the company of. But I think that we've all been in a life situation where we've seen somebody like that, right? And hubris is a very interesting one, because on the one hand, it often does stimulate from things in our life that we might have been successful in, but the otherwise positive feedback that we would receive when filtered through a dysfunctional psychology causes us to overcompensate for those victories. And instead of a healthy natural confidence boost and a healthy feeling of self-worth, we glorify it beyond its reasonable level, and we use it to artificially bloat our own self-image. We get overly triumphant, very vainglorious, and very narcissistic. I always think about hubris as like putting a crown on a corpse. It doesn't matter how much that you dress it up nicely, it's not going to get rid of the stench that's in the air. And you'll see this in people who have accumulated a large deposit of strength in one area of their life, but because they're under the influence of the weakling and dominance, it makes them overestimate their power, and they funnel that into the ego, which then fosters a hubris. And displays of hubris are always masquerades for the hidden weakling. And so let's look at a few ways that this can present itself. So this comes about through any activity where, like we've said, we've seen an accumulation of competence, and with that adjustment, we receive a feeling of self-confidence in our competency, which at first glance seems like a net positive to us. But, as we've said, if it translates through a dysfunctional part of our psychology, which it often is, it converts the effect and feeds into nourishing the existent patterns of weakness that we hold within us. So, for example, this might be through competence at sports. People practice at sports, they become skillful at it over time. There's also a high rate of competition involved, and success in these areas naturally generates a feeling of ascent. a feeling that we're migrating somewhere in life. We're moving up dominance hierarchies, as Jordan Peterson likes to say all the time. And this sounds very well and good, but what often happens is that whilst all this development is going on in one area of our lives, if we identify with patterns of weakness, part of its positive resource gets leached off and feeds into the pre-existent feelings of inferiority that were already there before we started on that positive pattern of activity. And far from overcoming those weaknesses through victory, it actually makes the psychological compound even stronger. And if you've ever been in a sports team or borne witness to things like this in good documentaries like Pumping Iron with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, you'll be aware of that one guy in the pack who's a real try-hard man, and he's really hyper-intensive about his training, and he's always putting on these displays of competence signaling to other people around him, making lots of unnecessary drama about it, getting overly worked up about his training regimen or bragging about his gains in one form or another. And he's doing this not because he isn't physically competent, he is, but he's doing it because he's reacting to a secret part of himself that has him locked. And that's a festering, a weakness within him that on the one hand drives him with this dark energy to become better than everybody else around him, but on another level it's eating him from the inside. And so he doubles down and he exhibits all of this hyper aggressive overcompensatory behavior. So yeah, just because you're a great athlete or because you're an ace quarterback on the sports team does not disqualify you at all from these hidden processes in the mind. You can be physically healthy, train hard, work hard, but what's motivating you within is an identification with a weakness within yourself, a hidden weakness that you've held in your heart for so long. And even though on the outside you might look very powerful, on the inside you are enslaved to the patterns of a masochistic impulse that pushes you whilst it's killing you. And the more it pushes you, the more it kills you, until there's a crisis and it spills out into the world as an outburst of chaos. Another example where we might see an exhibition of the weakling is through the intellect, which is a very common sight that I've seen actually. People who are psychologically dysfunctional in some area of their life, but also very intellectual, also tend to possess a hubris about their ability to be able to handle complex ideas. So, like our dysfunctional bodybuilder, people who are on the more intellectual side of things, they grow through their mentation, and as a result they place a great deal of their self-worth in their ability to be able to process complex systems. And if they're hubristic about it, they might contrast themselves with other people who don't possess such a profound ability to be able to handle complex systems. And so they start to entertain the idea that they are superior to all of the peons down there who can't handle complex theory or some esoteric philosophical tract or some other. And this is the weakling speaking through the inflated ego again. Reward from the accomplishment gets parasitized by our feelings of inadequacy and generates a bloated, distorted vision of ourselves in counteraction. We start to think of ourselves as special and gloat above others. We become narcissistic and become like junkies, psychologically intoxicated on our own feelings of grandeur that we keep on returning to, when in reality, we are not special people. We are possessed by an unconscious parasite that consistently makes us feel weak, and we harness our positive ability to its ends, whilst falsely believing that we are the ones becoming stronger through its exercise. Accomplishment in these kind of situations is always used as a remedy to stave off feelings of inferiority, feelings that derive from patterns in our life history that we have not yet faced up to, and perhaps are not even aware of because they've been repressed for so long that they've now become unconscious. The key to this problem is practiced conscientiousness and consistent efforts at acquiring self-knowledge. And like I said earlier, if we have the right attitude and clarity of vision, our mistakes can be our greatest teachers and they can show us the paths to glory. But in order to do that, we have to first honestly accept the reality of our failure whilst renouncing the identification with failure by we listening to it and by learning from it as a teacher. And through listening to it, that will highlight the areas of our life that needed to be attended to and we need to work on. So what we need to counteract, what we need to counteract the weakling, should I say, is not tough love or a stiff upper lip, as they say here in England, because these are simply more exercises in repression. The application of the very archetype that is being misused is the key to the solution. What is needed is an intelligent activation of our warrior potential to interface with these systems and translate them into a benefit that will show us a way out of our dysfunctional cycles of behavior that keep us in a state of weakness and dissatisfaction. All that we need is a shift in attitude. I remember years ago when I was heavily interested in Gnosticism, and I came across a passage in a book that I was reading that was addressing the very different mentality that the Gnostics had towards self-development. And ever since I read it, I've always remembered it and I've always found it very inspiring. And it said, "To a Gnostic, the greatest discovery imaginable is another flaw." And I think that wonderfully encapsulates the kind of attitude that is necessary to address these patterns of personal dysfunction that contribute to these morbid attachments to weakness. Even in highly disturbed psychologies, the mind is always communicating to us about ways that we can heal. So whenever we have a dark dream or find ourselves possessed again by some dark cycle of thought that we keep on going down over and over again, the best thing to do is not to displace that, is not to reject that and hold your hand up to that shadow material and say, no, that's not what I want to face up to right now. That deliberate ignorance is precisely the reason why these patterns are cycling and why these patterns are still affecting you. And they will keep on affecting you if you keep displacing them, if you don't alter the quality of your relationship to them. And that calls for a radical shift in attitude and perspective. And I think that these archetype videos are potentially going to orientate us in that better direction, because if these videos are just novel intrigues that we put on a bit after work for some light entertainment, then every word that has fallen out of my mouth will have been wasted. We have the profound capacity to become more than what we already are right now. And those times in our lives when we have turned things around and put ourselves on a better direction in life are total testament to that. They are indicative of this warrior initiative to seize life by the horns and triumph. But often, in order to do that, we have to interface with phenomena that makes us feel very uncomfortable. And often the more uncomfortable something makes us feel inside is usually an indication that something important lies in there that can show us the way forward. Think about all of the great heroic movies that we've seen in our lives, and think about the progression that those individuals make from the first time that you see them to the way that they look on the end. The Luke Skywalker standing with a look of uncertainty in his eyes before the twin sunsets of his planet Tatooine is not the same Luke Skywalker that we see as a warrior confronting the shadow of his father years later. Those twin suns were setting because a whole life had come to an end, and the shadow that he confronted in the image of his father was also the shadow of himself, biologically and psychologically. Do you remember in the warrior video that I made where I was talking about the warrior being tied into patterns of mastery over systems? They could be technological systems, social dynamics, creative systems, anywhere where we would have to grapple with a complicated situation and overcome that situation through interface. That driving, energetic agency is very much a core aspect of our warrior potential. And I think that these can be certainly applied to psychological systems as well, especially so, because as we've seen in this treatment of the weakling, the quality of our relationship that we have towards our psychological systems determines the quality of relationship that we have to the outside world. And if we've become morbidly preoccupied with certain simulations of our past history, which is very common, I have this as well, then it becomes easier for us to identify more strongly with images of failure and images of weakness that can lead to a dysfunctional tangle within our minds. It's a confrontation with that inner uncertainty that tells us to remain in what we know and what we find familiar that comes up against the warrior initiative to seek our mastery from the systems of life. No one can become a master in anything unless they accept the existence of the uncertainty that is already inside of them. And when there is a radical transformation of perception and attitude towards the relationship with our own inner nature, that transforms our relationship to life. This isn't mere inspired talk. This is observable, demonstratable fact. And part of being a warrior in the world is coming up against the fact that we have to fail more times than we will succeed. And that the higher we ascend, the higher the possibility of failure exceeds the possibility for success. But then again, the rewards are higher. I'm going to end with a quote by Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali once said, "Being a loser isn't losing 100 times before you finally win. Being a loser is losing the first few times and giving up." And I think that that's a really good quote to end on for this video about the weakling and what we've said about reconciling with its shadow nature. So that's another one down in the Archetypes series. This has been a pretty interesting one, a bit longer than some of the others, but I think that these shadow ones necessitate that because, as I said, if these things are just going to be intellectual curiosities, then I might as well give up. They have to be contextualized within the patterns of our own life experiences and interfaced with readily, because otherwise it's just, conceptual talk. So I hope that you found this video interesting nonetheless. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again in the next one.